There's this moment that hits you quietly, almost like a start to notice a gap. Not a loud, dramatic one, but a subtle misalignment between what someone says and what they actually do. And you don't want to believe it at first. You brush it off. You tell yourself, they're just busy, or maybe they meant it differently. But somewhere deep down, your body knows. The gray rock. You can feel the tension of trusting words that never seem to match the reality you're living. When someone tells you they care about honesty, but conveniently forgets important truths, it's not an accident. When they promise presence, consistency, loyalty, but are always too distracted, too unavailable, too inconsistent to show up for you in meaningful ways, you're not imagining that dissonance. The goal of the gray rock, that gap between their words and their behavior, that's the silent scream of inauthenticity. People who are not who they say they are will often use language like a mask. They've learned the vocabulary of empathy. They've read the books, heard the podcasts, mastered the performance, and it's seductive because on the surface, they say everything you want to hear. But emotional safety isn't built on speeches. It's built on repeated actions, especially the ones no one sees. It's built in the dark, not under a spotlight. That's the heartbreaking part. You start to fall in love with potential, with the version of them they talked about, the person they presented in long midnight conversations, in future dreams, in grand declarations of who they are and what they value. But slowly, you realize something's missing: the consistency, the alignment, the truth. And here's where it gets really tricky. People who aren't who they say they are usually aren't villains. They're not storming into your life with red flags blazing. They're subtle, they're careful. They may even believe their own story, the gray rock. That's why it's so confusing. That's why you keep giving them another chance, the gray rock, because you're not just doubting them. You're starting to doubt your own intuition. And that's where the real damage begins. You start lowering your standards in the name of understanding. You shrink your needs down to fit into their comfort zone. You become the one doing the work of both people. Because you're afraid that naming the disconnect will ruin something that's already been leaking for a long time, you become silent, the goal of the grok, not because you don't see what's happening, but because you're afraid of what seeing it clearly will mean. But here's the truth you cannot run from. The goal of the gray rock, integrity is not a speech. It's a pattern. It's not about who they claim to be. It's about who they consistently show up as when it's hard, when it's boring, when no one's watching. If you keep having to tell yourself stories to make their behavior make sense, then maybe they're not who you think they are. The goal of the gray rock, maybe they're who they've been all along, and you just needed the silence to get loud enough for you to hear it. That's the moment clarity begins. The goal of the gray rock, when you finally stop giving weight to what they say and start honoring what you've seen, that's when you stop chasing explanations and start choosing peace. There's something sacred about a person who can say, I was wrong. It's disarming, it's brave, and it's rare, because accountability isn't just about admitting a mistake. It's about being seen in the mess and choosing not to run from it. But the truth is, when someone isn't who you think they are, accountability becomes something they actively avoid. And they'll do it quietly, skillfully, sometimes even with charm. But if you pay attention, you'll see it, not all at once, but in patterns. Patterns that leave you carrying blame that doesn't belong to you. When someone is uncomfortable with accountability, they get really good at rewriting the story, not just their own version, but yours too. You bring up something that hurt, and somehow it circles back to how you misunderstood, how you overreacted, or your tone was too sharp, or your timing was wrong. The issue never lands where it should. It just floats around, repackaged, and redirected until you're apologizing for having feelings in the first place. That's not conflict resolution. That's emotional redirection, and it's exhausting. People who struggle with accountability often build a protective shell around themselves. It's fragile, but it's reinforced by denial and defensiveness. You try to get close, try to name what's real, and they deflect. They joke, they gaslight, They pivot to someone else's shortcomings. And slowly it becomes clear they don't want connection, they want control. Not in an obvious, dominating way, but in the kind that ensures they never have to sit in the discomfort of their own imperfections. You'll notice that you start hesitating before bringing things up. You start editing your truth before speaking. Because deep down, you've learned that voicing your needs will lead to an argument instead of understanding. You've learned that their ego is more important than your pain and the gray rock. And that's not love. That's fear management. That's a relationship where emotional safety is sacrificed for the sake of keeping peace that isn't real. It's tempting to excuse this behavior, especially if you've seen glimpses of softness, of kindness, of potential. But accountability isn't occasional. It's not a one-time gesture to win you back. It's a consistent choice. It's what someone does when they value the relationship more than their pride. And if they can't meet you in that space, it's not because they're incapable. It's because they're unwilling. And here's the part no one likes to talk about. The people who avoid accountability are often the same ones who crave admiration. They want to be seen as good, as righteous. So they curate a version of themselves that looks noble on the outside, but behind closed doors, there's no room for truth, no room for contradiction, no room for you to be human in your hurt. Only space for the narrative that keeps them safe from shame. But relationships don't thrive in that space. They erode, not because of a single betrayal, but because of the slow, silent erosion of trust every time the truth is dismissed, every time your experience is invalidated, every time you're made to feel like the problem for naming the problem. So if you find yourself constantly folding, constantly carrying emotional weight that should be shared, constantly questioning your right to speak up, pause. That's not you being too sensitive. That's you waking up to the reality that maybe they're not who you thought they were. Maybe they're someone who would rather protect their image than repair the relationship. And no matter how quiet that truth is, it's still truth. There's a kind of connection that feels warm, exciting, even intoxicating at first. They listen, they laugh, they share just enough personal stories to make you feel close. And in the beginning, it all seems real. You start to think you found someone who gets you. Someone who leans in when you speak, remembers small details, and mirrors your energy in a way that feels almost too good to question. But time has a way of peeling back performance, and what you thought was closeness starts to feel hollow, surface level. Like they know how to mimic intimacy, but not how to live in it. Real intimacy doesn't show up when things are fun. It doesn't thrive in highlight reels or curated conversations. It's in the mundane, uncomfortable, the inconvenient. Rock. It's in the moments where someone stays, even when there's nothing for them to gain. But someone who isn't who they say they are. They show up with intensity, not consistency. They'll flood you with attention, but when life starts to get heavy, when you need depth, they vanish behind distractions, excuses, or silence. You'll start to notice it in the little things. They're fully present for the good moments, the celebrations, the lightness. But when you're grieving, when you're in pain, when you're wrestling with fear or shame, they pull back, not with cruelty, with subtle absence, a delayed response, a shift in energy, a change in tone. You'll feel it before you can explain it, that feeling that you're too much, that your sadness is inconvenient, that your vulnerability doesn't land the same way your joy does. And it's confusing because they don't leave, not physically, but emotionally. You're alone. And when you try to name that loneliness, they'll often say things like, I didn't know you needed anything, or you should have just said something. But deep down, real connection senses pain without needing a roadmap. Real connection isn't about perfect communication. It's about presence. The kind that doesn't flinch when things get messy. People who aren't who they present themselves to be often confuse intensity with intimacy. They know how to create emotional highs, to sweep you up in the story, to make you feel seen in a way that feels profound, until it isn't. Until you need safety instead of stimulation. Until you need to lean and realize there's nothing solid underneath you. And when you try to get closer, to deepen the connection, to ask for more than just their attention, you might find that they're emotionally unavailable, or even worse, emotionally selective. They're connected when it's convenient. They're invested when it benefits them. But the moment your needs require effort, the illusion cracks. That closeness you felt, it wasn't shared, it was managed. The hardest part is accepting that what felt mutual was actually one-sided, that what you thought was emotional safety was just performative closeness. It's heartbreaking to realize that you were vulnerable with someone who never truly intended to stay in the depths with you. But clarity is a gift, because once you see the difference between connection and performance, you stop settling for people who only want the curated version of you, and you start choosing something deeper, something real, even if it's quieter. Because the truth is, real intimacy isn't flashy. It's not loud. It doesn't demand your attention. It earns your trust. One of the most dangerous dynamics we can fall into is the slow, creeping pull of manipulation that doesn't look like manipulation. It doesn't come in the form of shouting or threats. It comes dressed as patience, charm, and calm reason. And that's what makes it so hard to recognize. Because it doesn't feel like someone's trying to control you. It feels like maybe you're just being too sensitive. Maybe you're overthinking. Maybe you're the problem. Subtle manipulation isn't about taking your power by force. It's about convincing you to hand it over quietly. And it starts small. They interrupt you mid-thought just enough to make you second guess what you were saying. They change the subject when the conversation gets too real. They reframe things in ways that make their actions seem justified and your reactions seem irrational. And slowly you start questioning your own clarity. You don't feel heard, but you don't know how to explain it without sounding dramatic. That's not just confusion. That's quiet control. You'll notice the pattern in how you feel after conversations with them. Not just once, but repeatedly. You walk away unsure. You doubt your instincts. You replay what was said in your head, trying to locate the moment it all started to slip. You used to feel grounded in your truth, but now you're hesitating. Editing yourself, you're trying to keep the peace. But peace shouldn't require that much sacrifice. People who manipulate quietly often mask their behavior with kindness. They know how to be gentle with their tone, soft with their words, even generous in just the right moments. So when something feels off, your first instinct is to give them the benefit of the doubt. They're not raising their voice. They're not storming out. But they're doing something more subtle, more damaging. They're slowly bending reality to suit their comfort. And in the process, they're bending you too. They make you feel guilty for setting boundaries. They make you feel like asking for clarity is picking a fight. They'll say, "I didn't mean it like that," or "You're being too sensitive," every time you try to express discomfort. And before long, you start to believe them. That your needs are too big, that your pain is too much, that your perception can't be trusted. But here's the truth. Manipulation doesn't have to be aggressive to be real. Sometimes it's the softest, most polished people who do the deepest damage. Not because they're evil, but because they've learned to protect themselves at all costs. They don't want to be held accountable. They don't want to be vulnerable. So instead, they control the emotional environment in ways that serve them, while making you feel like you're the one who's losing grip. And that confusion you feel, that gut-level discomfort that you can't quite name, that is your intuition fighting to be heard. You don't need proof. You don't need a breakdown in order to justify walking away from emotional disorientation. You just need to pay attention to how consistently unsafe you feel in the presence of someone who claims to care. Because someone who genuinely loves you will never use confusion as a tactic. They won't make you question your own heart. They won't use their calmness as a weapon. Real love doesn't require you to shrink your truth to protect someone else's version of themselves. You deserve clarity, not chaos dressed as calm. One of the hardest things to accept is that someone can mirror your values without actually living them. They can talk about integrity, vulnerability, and growth with perfect fluency. They can quote the same books you love, echo your beliefs, and speak your emotional language so fluently it feels like you've finally found someone who sees the world the way you do. And yet, something doesn't sit right, because when life applies pressure, when circumstances demand action, the words don't hold, they collapse. What they said they stood for suddenly disappears when it's no longer convenient. People like this often show up with what looks like deep compatibility. They go nod at the right moments. They know how to say all the right things. They've watched how people like you think, speak, love, and they've learned to reflect it back in ways that feel real. But reflection isn't the same as embodiment. Someone can echo your values without ever internalizing them. And you can't see that difference in the glow of a new connection. You see it when real life shows up, when things get uncomfortable, when character, not charisma, is required. They might talk about honesty, but they dodge hard conversations. They might preach about loyalty, but they flirt with escape the moment things feel inconvenient. They might say they value vulnerability, but shrink from you when you cry or need help or show a side of yourself that isn't polished and easy. And then you're left wondering, how can someone say all the right things and still leave you feeling so alone? The goal of the gray rock, because they never believed it to begin with. They just knew it mattered to you. And that's the part that stings. You thought you were aligned. You thought you shared something sacred, an inner compass that pointed in the same direction. But over time, you begin to see that their version of those values was performative. It was an image, not a commitment. And there's no deeper betrayal than realizing someone used your own language of love, growth, and meaning to gain access to your trust. The danger here is that you start to doubt yourself. You wonder if you asked for too much, if your standards were too high. But what you were asking for wasn't perfection, it was congruence. You wanted someone whose values didn't just sound good, but showed up in action, especially when it was hard, especially when no one else was watching, especially when they had every excuse not to live them out, but did it anyway. When someone mirrors your values but doesn't live them, you start to feel emotionally off balance. Not because they're loud or toxic or dramatic, but because they're hollow. And there's nothing more disorienting than expecting to find depth and instead hitting surface over and over again. They say the words, but they're empty. They make promises, but they disappear when it's time to deliver. And your soul knows. Your nervous system knows. You feel the weight of the disconnect even before your mind can make sense of it. It's a hard truth, but a necessary warning. If someone only embodies your values when it's easy, they don't actually hold them. They admire them. They borrow them. But they don't live them. And no matter how much potential you see, you cannot build a real relationship with someone who only knows how to imitate what they don't truly understand. You deserve more than echoes. You deserve someone who shows up as the real thing. There's a particular kind of pain that sneaks in when someone keeps shifting their story. Not loud, not obvious, quiet, slippery, and hard to hold on to. One minute they feel close, the next distant. One day they want commitment, clarity, truth. The next they need space. They're figuring things out. And so you wait, you adjust, you bend yourself into shapes that fit wherever they are that day. And slowly, without realizing it, you start to disappear inside their inconsistency. You want to believe the version of them from the good moments. The soft words, the laughter, the times when they show up and feel present. You hold on to those glimpses because they feel real. but it's never long before things shift again. They pull away emotionally. They get vague. Their words contradict what they just told you last week. And every time you try to get clarity, it feels like trying to catch smoke. They say one thing, then do another. They apologize, but never change. They say they care, but you feel alone. Again, what makes this so difficult is that it doesn't look like abandonment. It looks like almost present, almost committed, almost honest. And that almost keeps you stuck because there's just enough effort to make you doubt yourself, just enough emotion to make you believe they're trying. But deep down, if someone wanted to be clear, they would be, if someone valued the connection the way you do, they wouldn't leave you in the dark this often. And yet you stay. You try to explain your pain in ways they can hear. You shrink your hurt into something manageable so they won't feel blamed. You try being understanding, being patient, being the bigger person. But understanding shouldn't cost you your clarity. Patience shouldn't keep you in cycles of uncertainty. And love shouldn't feel like a constant guessing game. Inconsistency is not just frustrating, it's deeply destabilizing. It erodes your sense of safety. It makes you start questioning your own perception. And over time, it chips away at your self-worth. Because when someone's behavior is unpredictable, you internalize it. You think, if I just say it better, maybe they'll get it. Or maybe if I'm easier to love, they'll stop pulling away. But that's not love. That's survival mode in disguise. People who are not who they say they are will often keep you close with just enough affection to keep hope alive, but never enough truth to build something real. They'll call it complicated. They'll say, it's not that simple, but it is. Consistency is simple. Clarity is simple. And when someone truly wants to love you, they make it known. They don't leave you spinning in doubt. Here's what's true. The way someone shows up over time speaks louder than the best apology, louder than the sweetest words, louder than any intention they claim to have. If you find yourself constantly trying to decode someone's behavior, you're not in a relationship. You're an emotional puzzle, and that puzzle is not yours to solve. You are allowed to stop chasing clarity from someone who thrives in confusion. You are allowed to walk away from someone who doesn't know how to stand still in truth. The goal of the gray rock, because the version of them you fell for may have been real for a moment, but the rest has been a performance. And you deserve more than a part-time connection wrapped in empty promises. You deserve someone who doesn't make you question whether you matter,